The sky over Carnath Prime split like velvet torn by impatient fingers, a clean green gash that refused to bleed. Anti-air tracers climbed to meet it, stitching furious prayers into the jaundiced clouds. Shells screamed, then paused mid-flight as if embarrassed to be seen. Their shrapnel softened into a swirl of black birds that cackled as they wheeled away over the burning hive. Inquisitor Avery Stone watched from the roof of the cathedral, cloak tugged sideways by a wind that smelled of promethium and old incense. Refugees pressed against broken gargoyles. A gun crew knelt by a heavy stubber, waiting for an order that would make them feel less like spectators. Below the parapet, the city burned in tears, a wedding cake set too close to the sun. Something stepped through the tear and made gravity remember its manners. Tall, green, a helm that suggested horns without needing them. The figure took a single step and the nearby smoke folded around him as if the air itself had been expecting a guest. Alpha-level psyker, Chaplain Grant Holden said, voice a graveled sermon behind his helmet grill. He lifted his Crozius, the head of the weapon buzzing with restrained thunder. On your knees. The newcomer sat instead, right on the parapet's edge, feet dangling above 1,000 meters of nothing. He smiled like he'd just found a clever misprint in a holy book. There, he said. Now we are all comfortable. Muggo's Kellen Rhodes clicked across the stone on spider-leg augmetics, cables whispering, lenses irised. Mechadendrites sniffed the air. Inquisitor, he crackled. Pattern analysis returns warp-adjacent signature with low entropic noise. Non-demonic. It is clean. Nothing clean comes from that storm, Stone said, but she kept her pistol low. She'd learned years ago that the first words you spoke to a monster had teeth that bit both ways. Identify yourself. Names, the man in green said, are the smallest kind of magic. He tapped his chest, amused at his own manners. Call me Loki. A lance strike split a distant spire. The cathedral shuddered under Stone's boots. Loki glanced toward the wound in the city, cocked his head as if critiquing a performance. Your enemies, he said, seldom go in for panache. They prefer results, Stone answered. And yet you, Loki said, prefer timing. He turned his palm outward. Light ran across his skin in thin green runes, but when the Sisters of Silence stepped forward the light guttered and went out as if plunged into dark water. The temperature seemed to drop a degree. The sound of the battlefield thinned to a dull, stubborn hush. Holden strode closer, each step a vow. You will submit to containment, he said, or we will erase what you are. What I am, Loki said mildly, is an argument with destiny. He looked past Holden to Stone, reading her the way a riddle reads its solver. And you collect arguments. Refugees flinched as another salvo peeled a strip of masonry from the dome. A child started crying, a thin keen that couldn't find a rhythm in the null silence. Stone's hand twitched toward her pistol, then away. She had the sudden, ridiculous image of that green tear above the city as a curtain in a theater. She hated the image for how right it felt. Custody, she said finally. For your safety. How thoughtful, Loki said, and let the sisters snap void-cold shackles around his wrists. They drew him inside a portable null field, a spiked bronze frame humming softly, carried by two silent figures whose faces were as unreadable as blank parchment. On the way to the stairwell hatch, a shell fell too close. The roof jumped. The heavy stubber crew stumbled. The weapon slewed toward the parapet. Loki's eyes flicked. A rivet popped from the stubber's carriage with a sound like a plucked string, and the gun sagged just before it could rake the crowd. Stone looked at him. He didn't bother to look innocent. They moved along the buttress toward a blasted service door. Holden paced beside them, the weight of his armored footfalls arguing doctrine with the stone. Rhodes crabbed ahead, muttering data to himself like prayer. Down the tower's throat the stairwell smelled of wet stone and hot metal and the faint copper of panic. Explain the ravens, Stone said as they descended. An apology, Loki said. The shells wanted to be something else. I obliged. Shells don't want anything, Holden said. Everything wants something, Loki replied. Even silence. The null field made him a colder presence at the center of the party. Even his breath seemed to happen at arm's length. Yet the words came easy. Stone had put men to the question who died before they finished saying their names. This one was taking his time. They will call you witch, she said. Chaos will call you cousin. I will call you what your actions demand. Merciful, Loki said, amused. That speech would have been shorter if you preferred fire. I prefer facts. Then a fact, Loki said. In 10 minutes, the Vanguard flotilla will translate out of the cloud cover early. They will mistake eagerness for inevitability. If you redeploy your flak to the 3rd grid. The stairwell shook. Flakes of plaster fell in a dry snow. Sirens found them, thin and far and angry. Stone clicked her vox. Signal command, she said. Confirm translation signatures. Rhodes' lenses spun, throwing green notations across his face. Cross-checking, he whispered. Yes. Translation variants, unscheduled. Pattern cluster consistent with. Eagerness, Loki finished, with the tired patience of a tutor. Holden's helm turned. How do you know their plans? I know people, Loki said. And there are not as many kinds as they insist. They reached the amphitheater beneath the cathedral, a bowl of black stone set like a tongue in the earth. The air in it pressed inward. Sister silent. Null loud. The bronze frame was fixed into a plinth at the center, and the hum climbed into the bones. Loki tested the space with a look, not a spell. When his hand moved, it was only to pocket a loose coin of green glass he must have lifted from somewhere on the way down. He flicked it. It spun between his fingers, then stilled, obedient to a physics that owed him nothing. Stone took her place at the rim, feet on a line in the stone worn smooth by centuries of feet making the same choice. Tell me what you are, she said. In simpler ages, Loki said. A god. In this one, perhaps only an impatient possibility. Who sent you? Loki tilted his head toward the ceiling, toward the distant city and the wound in the sky. Curiosity, he said. It's a terrible supervisor. Holden paced the inner circle, reciting low. Purity seals fretted along his armor like tattered red grass. If you are no demon, he said, prove it. I do not take kindly to additions, Loki said, unless the stage is interesting. Make it interesting, Stone said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. He studied her for a moment, and for the first time the performance dimmed. A line of genuine attention drew itself between them, plain as chalk. You, he said, wish to win without becoming what you fight. If I fail, Stone said, I light the city regardless. And then, Loki said, even your victories will taste of ash. Rhodes cleared his vocoder. Inquisitor, if I may, the signature is clean. Geometric almost. Warp phenomena resist that. They blur, they fray. He doesn't. Or he hides the fray better than most, Holden said. Or, Loki offered, I did not use the door you fear. The amphitheater flexed around the conversation like a throat swallowing a difficult truth. Above them, something big died loudly. Dust sifted down like failing snow. Stone remembered the child's thin keen on the roof and felt a piece of herself reach for the worst and most efficient choice. She had executed on less. But there was the way Loki had looked at the stubber before it could kill 10 civilians for the comfort of a mistake. There was the way he told the truth with jokes and the way lies came dressed as certainty in other men's mouths. Help this world, she said, and I will listen to your bargain. Refuse, and the only mercy you receive will be quick. Loki tipped the green coin off his knuckle. It fell, rang once on the stone, and when it stopped moving it wasn't a coin at all but a small feather etched with faint runes along the vein. He didn't pick it up. A proper stage cue, he said softly. Very well. Terms, Holden said. Later, Stone said. He works first. Loki looked up through the layers of cathedral and smoke and sky as if he could see the whole hive in a cross-section, as if he could reach into it and rearrange the moving parts by asking them to be kinder. The null hum pressed in. He smiled anyway, like a man about to tell a joke to a hostile room. Bring me your vox map, he said, and your list of officers who cannot resist a dramatic order. Rhodes thrust a slate toward him. hands trembling with the greed of a scholar presented with a new kind of puzzle. Holden stood too close, daring mischief. Stone did not move at all. Somewhere above, sirens overlapped into a single note. Somewhere closer, the feather on the stone refused to blow away. The door at the top of the amphitheater opened. Cold air spilled down the steps. Stone's escort waited there, outlines hard against the glow. She didn't look back. Her eyes were on Loki as he began to speak to their network in a voice that sounded like someone opening a locked window. The city listened. And beyond the wall, the silence waited to see if it would be broken by screams, by laughter, or by something stubborn and human in between. The first voice that answered him was the city's, ragged, overlapping, half-broken, and Loki treated it like a skittish animal, offering it something simple to trust. He didn't cast a net over the Vox so much as tune it, adjusting for pride, boredom, and impatience the way a musician adjusts for humidity. Names scrolled across Rhodes's slate. Platoon leaders who barked like stage actors, gunners who loved heroics, a destroyer captain rumored to ignore advice unless it arrived as prophecy. Loki's fingertips hovered over the map and he began to suggest, not command. A training code murmured where it should not have existed. A cautionary tale about friendly fire incidents circulated with a convincing incident number. A supply convoy's route acquired a ghost twin one block over, complete with spice of rumor and the promise of loot. Nothing loud. Lots of reasonable. Above, the vanguard flotilla hit at the tempo of arrogance. A wing of raiders veered for the phantom convoy. Anti-air tracked an approach that wasn't, then caught the real one with a late wall of fire. 2 batteries elsewhere received contradictory orders and spent a minute arguing through static, until a third voice, weary and familiar, cut through with authority. Stone listened to the same voice and glanced at Loki. He didn't bother to look innocent. He looked pleased a plan was behaving like a plan. The null field gnawed at his edges and left the core of him intact. 5 minutes, Rhodes breathed, eyes glittering with green reflections. He's bought us 5. Then spend them, Stone said into her Vox. Positions shifted. Civilians bled into safer corridors. Holden dispatched a squad to a stairwell that would become fatal in 12 minutes if unattended. He never asked how Loki knew the thing about 12 minutes. He asked something else. What do you want in return? The chaplain said, voice low enough that it was not a challenge, only a line in the dirt. A good story, Loki said. And for you to tell it. Holden's helm hid everything but the angle of his head. I don't tell jokes. You tell absolutes, Loki said gently. They're just louder jokes. The sisters tightened the frame and the prisoner tilted his face as if to feel the pressure rise. He never pushed back against it. He yielded in a way that made resistance unnecessary. Stone watched for the tell, the flinch, the place where his mask cracked. She didn't find it. Her Vox clicked twice with a priority intrusion she had not authorized. Rhodes flinched, tapping a warding sigil on the rim of his slate. Source unknown, he said. The voice that came through could have been wind caught in a glass throat. It spoke old syllables and then a translation rode parallel, formal and clear. Inquisitor. Your world burns on a timeline threaded to my own. Delay the strike on the cathedral spire and the branch you stand on does not snap. I ask this in exchange for a path your warriors cannot discover. Stone's eyes cut to Loki. He widened his own comic innocence with a fuse burning behind it. That, he said, is not me. Holden's gauntlet flexed on his Crozius. Eldari, he said. The word dragged talons down his armor. Of course they found the same knot, Loki said. Weavers tend to find the tangle. Trace the signal, Stone told Rhodes. Local, he said, surprised. Under the nave. A maintenance corridor. The pattern echoes, strange. He didn't say beautiful. He meant it anyway. Stone made her decision the way she always did when any choice looked like a sin. She picked the one that let her see more before she committed to fire. Holden, she said. With me. Sisters, maintain the field and move. They descended not into the amphitheater but along another throat of the cathedral, a cough of dust and machine breath. Pipes sweated. Runes of disrepair glowed a dull amber where servitors had not been this week. The signal drew them toward a seam of wall that should have been just stone and prayer. It wasn't. The air there had the tension of a wave that had decided not to break. She saw the woman step out of that decision like someone returning from a room you cannot fit in your head. Tall, robed in night smoothed with silver. A mask over the upper face, crystalline and merciless. A spear that looked grown, not forged. Farser, Stone said, because names could be weapons when given without expectation. You trespass. We arrive, the Eldari said. Her voice held the weight of a singer practicing alone. The difference is what you do next. Holden stepped between them, weapon vertical. The sister carrying the null frame angled it to keep Loki at the edge of whatever this was. He stood very still, the way a man stands when one wrong laugh could collapse a fragile bridge. The Farser's gaze touched him and then moved away with something like distaste, like recognition. You are not of the screaming sea, she said. I prefer theaters, Loki answered. Better seats. Her eyes ticked back to Stone. A spear thrust toward the spire would break something I cannot afford to lose later. In exchange for misdirecting it, I will reveal a path under your city that opens into the ribs of the enemy. They will not expect you from there. And when my men walk your path, Holden said, what does it take from them? The same thing any path takes, she said. Time. Stone didn't trust the answer. She trusted the way it didn't try to be nicer than the truth. She didn't look at Loki. She kept him at the edge of her vision. We misdirect, she said, but not to spare your craft world a future debt. We do it because it saves lives now. It saves both, the Farser said, and for a heartbeat something uncynical washed through her vowels. The skein is stingy with gifts. They moved fast after that. Not allies, not enemies. Just people who had noticed the same fire and decided to cup their hands in the same way. The Farser described a gate under the cathedral like a vein of frozen sea. Rhodes pinged the area and cursed softly. His cogitators hated the results and tried to file them under miracle, which offended them. Holden detached a squad with orders that sounded like blasphemy dressed up as discipline, and the men obeyed because his voice had been built to be believed. The sisters stood like the teeth of a lock and let the key turn. Loki's suggestions flowed back into the Voxnet with practiced ease. Lean on the ruin by the governor's east wall, he told a junior officer who fancied himself invisible. There's shelter there for 10 families if you say it like you mean it. He told a squad leader to pretend he was lost so the enemy would pounce on the decoy, and then told a sniper where to make the pounce regret its choices. He stitched small mercies into the edges of big cruelties until the pattern held. That was when Varric the Unmirthful made his entrance over open channels, as if reading from a catechism of pride. His voice rolled like iron dragged over stone. He had taken a shrine ruin near the river scoops and painted it with fresh blasphemy, and he invited any champion of the Corpse Emperor to try and take it back blade to blade. He promised to carve the winner's name into his armor. He promised to let the survivors keep the vowels. Holden's teeth met in a sound she could hear. He wants our strongest drawn into a duel while his pack circles. Then don't send your strongest, Loki said. He stepped forward and the null field reminded him of its rules. His expression flickered with the smallest annoyance a human could have missed. Stone did not miss it. Send your most annoying. Send me. No, Holden said, like a bolt around. Yes, Loki said, like a joke that keeps being true. I don't intend to kill him with strength. I intend to give his blade a better story to believe in. Stone's mouth was a line. She imagined the ruin. She imagined a man like a spiked altar standing inside it with a demon blade he fed on his own certainties. She imagined the broadcasts Varric would shape out of a victory, how despair would spread like mold through the refuges, how her agents would spend months bleaching it off the walls. She thought about the 5 minutes they'd bought, and the next 5, and the cost of every minute after. You will not go alone, she said. You will not take weapons. If you run, my men will not be able to shoot you fast enough. Do you understand what I'm saying? I do, Loki said, and bowed as if she had complimented him. He looked at the Farser as if to say, see, timing. The Farser did not lower her spear. She didn't need to. They moved Loki up out of the cathedral through a side gate and into a street shaped by shell impact and panic. Smoke wrote low sentences across the rooftops. Somewhere above, a ship died with a bang that wasn't a sound so much as a new absence of something. The sisters kept the null on him like a weather, but they didn't grip his arms. He didn't bother pretending he was a prisoner anymore. He let the roll fall off like a cloak when the sun comes out. They reached the district where stone saints had been shaved down to stumps by generations of wind, and then polished by one afternoon of war. The shrine's doors stood open as if inviting worship. Inside, the floor gleamed with oil and blood and the patience of decades. Varric's trophies grinned. A dozen helmed heads turned in their direction and then subsided at the gesture of a gauntlet that had once belonged to someone whose name mattered and no longer did. "Bring him," Varric said. His voice came through without the crackle of vox, as if the ruin had been waiting to speak for him. Holden drew up at the threshold. His men ghosted to flanking alcoves. Stone stood where the last of the light fell, half-shadowed, her pistol resting at her thigh. She had no illusions about control in this moment and kept her balance by pretending she did. Loki took one step into the shrine. The null field thrummed like bees in a jar. He smiled with his eyes, which meant the mouth could be any shape it liked and it wouldn't matter. "Do not be clever," Holden said, which was like telling water not to be wet. "I'm going to be precise," Loki said. "If you don't hear from me in 3 minutes, assume I chose a poor audience and improvise something loud." He walked into the cool stink and the green light from the broken stained glass painted him in ocean shades. Varric was taller by a head and all of it made of threat. The demon blade hummed as if eager to be fed words or throats, whichever came first. Loki stopped 2 paces beyond where any sane man would have, as if there were marks on the floor only he could see. He raised his empty hands the way a man raises a curtain. "Shall we," he said, "perform?" The ruin held its breath, and outside the smashed doors the city seemed to lean closer, listening. Varric laughed without moving his mouth, a low grinding happiness that came from the armor more than the man. Runes crawled across the demon blade, a script of hunger that read every living thing as a meal. He lifted it in a slow, theatrical arc, a promise and a threat. "You brought no weapon," he said. "I brought an audience," Loki answered, glancing toward the broken saints along the nave as if they might offer a review. "Sometimes that's enough." The sisters kept the null frame at the threshold. Its hum thickened the air like cold honey. Out here, deeper in the ruin, the pressure eased, attenuated by distance and old stone, yet still tugged at Loki's edges, making his tricks thin and crisp as frost. He took one more step until the hum just grazed him. Varric noticed. His grin got bigger, a slash under the skull visage. "Come be unmade," Varric said, and surged. He moved like a slab sliding downhill, speed made ugly by confidence. Loki did not dodge the first strike. He angled his body the way a door angles to let in a draft, and the blade kissed his coat where a heart prefers to hide. Holden swore, 1 foot already inside the threshold. Stone didn't move. She saw Loki set his feet the way a dancer chooses a board that won't betray her ankles. "And there it is," Loki said, almost bored. The first applause. Varric wrenched the blade free and the ruin answered with a sound like ropes creaking in an old theater. Dust sifted from the ribbed ceiling. The stained glass between the cracked saints shook and threw thin green light over everything. Loki swayed but did not fall. Where the blade had entered, cloth hung torn and clean, edges cauterized by a heat that hadn't happened. Varric blinked behind the skull. His armor's eyes, those little growths that weren't metal and weren't biology, opened a fraction wider. The demon in the blade purred, tasting a feast that wasn't there. It dragged its tongue across absence and went suddenly viciously hungry. "You're cheating," Varric said. "I'm obeying the rules," Loki said, and leaned infinitesimally into the null's fringe, letting the field take more of him. "You're the one who told your knife what meal you'd give it. You promised it a soul fat with worship. I'm afraid I've gone on a different diet." Varric roared and struck again. Loki let the blow land, but made it land where the world went thin, exactly where the null washed over him in a transparent tide. The metal shrieked at that edge where warp appetites met refusal. The blade drank and swallowed nothing. Starved fury raced back through it like lightning up a wet cord. Loki pivoted, because mischief loves footwork. He slid behind a toppled column and let his voice come from exactly where Varric didn't want it, right behind the ear slit. "You should never believe the first standing ovation," he whispered. The warlord spun, hacking at the whisper. The blade bit a statue and screamed. Hairline cracks raced across the column like frost. Loki was already somewhere else, not by miles but by decisions. He made tiny choices quickly. The way to stand so a watcher's eye slipped, the place to pause where the light couldn't quite agree you existed. The ruin seemed full of him, and yet he took up almost no space at all. Varric's breathing climbed into the audible range. The eyes along his gorget fluttered, mouths inside armor whispering indignities to no one. He drove the point of the demon blade into the flagstones to steady his vision, and the stone itself flinched from the wound. A flush crept over his pallid throat where the gorget gaped. It looked like embarrassment trying to be rage. "Face me," he snarled. "I am," Loki said from an angle that made the claim infuriating and true. Varric lunged. Loki slid one foot, a whisper across grit, and set his palm delicately on the flat of the blade as it passed. Not to stop it, merely to mark a rhythm. The contact made the demon inside recoil like a cat startled by its own reflection. It bucked toward its owner. Power backlashed. Eyes bloomed along Varric's breastplate, glossy and unhelpful. The blade's hum rose into a keen. Somewhere behind the skull, something realized it had been promised a banquet and led to a famine. Stone heard it, a shift from victory to doubt. The ruin's air tasted of hot copper and spite. Holden took one pace more into the nave and then forced himself still. He thirsted to intervene and refused the drink. "Do you know why your gods like you solemn?" Loki asked, voice calm now. "Because laughter belongs to people who imagine they can choose. They hate that sound." Varric slammed the blade down and it stuck, quivering. He used both hands and tore it free with a shout that sounded too much like fear. Loki didn't step back. He stepped inside the arc, so close the skull's teeth brushed the horn line of his helm. He let the null brush through him like a tide. It left him thinner, maybe, but it left him true. "Here," Loki said, and tapped the center of Varric's chest with 2 fingers. Nothing flashy. No light. No chord of revelation. Just a touch that the armor remembered afterward as permission it didn't want to have received. The runes along Varric's breastplate hiccuped, misreading Loki's precision as authority. The demon in the blade screamed again, and this scream turned inward, adjusting the math of hunger. If the promised feast was not where the knife had been told, perhaps the nearest soul would do. How convenient that it was already holding the hilt. Varric froze. The skull didn't blink, but whatever looked out from behind it jerked as if seeing its own reflection do something unforgivable. He took a breath that sounded like a seal breaking in a jar. Loki stepped away, no flourish, no bow, leaving space for inevitability to reach the stage on its own. The blade rippled. The singing in it became a chorus pulling toward the hilt, not the tip. Runes reversed direction. The first eye opened on Varric's forearm. The second opened under his jaw. The third tried to bloom over his heart and failed, slipping sideways into the meat. He swung, not at Loki now but at whatever clung to him. He hit his own shadow. It bled smoke. "I told you," Loki said, almost kind. "Never trust applause." Varric went to one knee, dragged there by something that wanted to stand in his place. He made a sound like a door being barred, and then, when he realized the bar was on the wrong side, something broke inside him that wasn't bone. He looked up and found Loki exactly where he had always been. 2 paces away, unarmed, amused, a little sad. "Enough," Stone said from the doorway, not to Loki but to fate. "End it." Loki lifted his hand, palm outward, and did the smallest thing a person can do. He shook his head as if at a stubborn child. The demon blade's song choked off. Varric sagged and stayed down. The eyes along his armor dimmed, then glazed, then went dull as coins left in river sand. When his gauntlet loosened, the blade hit the stone and cracked, not from force but from an argument it finally lost. A breath later, the ruin remembered how to be a building and let its tension go, creaking softly as if tired. Holden crossed to Loki in 3 long strides and stopped himself 1 stride short of reaching for his throat. The restraint cost him. He swallowed it anyway. "Did you kill him?" he asked. "No," Loki said. "He died from believing a weapon loved him." The chaplain looked at Varric's still form, at the blade shedding flakes like black snow. Some of the zeal bled out of his posture, replaced against his wishes with thought. Stone entered, pistol low, eyes sharp. The sisters brought the null frame near, and its hum moved across Loki like a curtain being drawn. He didn't resist. He raised his hands the way a man does when the scene is over and the audience deserves a bow. "Back to the amphitheater," she said. They brought him out under a sky that had decided on orange. Vox reports braided around them, enemy wings faltering, a destroyer captain arguing with a prophecy and losing. Refugees rerouted through a corridor that hadn't existed on any plan until someone insisted hard enough that it did. Stone filed it all. She filed the way Loki glanced upward as if he could see the fleet through stone and smoke, and the way the farcer's earlier promise sat in her mind like a coin she hadn't flipped yet. On the climb, Holden fell in beside Loki. "If your trick had failed," he said, voice quiet enough to be almost private. "What then?" "Then you would have made something loud," Loki said. "And I would have regretted wasting a good ending." "You call that a good ending?" "It kept options alive," Loki said. "Good enough." The amphitheater met them with its old hush. The frame locked into the plinth and the pressure tightened, making even words feel heavier to lift. Roads hovered at the rim, slayed alive with numbers that didn't like each other. "Enemy command just split," he said, hardly believing it. Half pushing toward the industrial quarter, half circling for the spire. "We cannot be 2 places at once." "You can be in 3, Loki said. He didn't wait for permission. He looked up at the dark and the dust and began to speak to the room like a man teaching a trick to a mirror. "Here are 3 futures," he said softly. "All true until someone chooses. Let them see them. Let them choose wrong." Stone tasted the risk and the necessity, salted and mixed. She glanced at Holden. He gave her nothing but his steady presence, which was the best kind of advice he knew how to give. She looked back at the prisoner in the cage that could not contain his ideas. "Show me," she said. Loki smiled without teeth and lifted his hands as if pulling curtains apart. The air above the amphitheater quivered, empty a heartbeat longer than was comfortable, and then began to fill with pictures no one had ordered and everyone recognized. The pictures gathered themselves out of the air the way frost gathers on glass. First a scatter of lines, then a coherence that stole breath. Above the amphitheater, a city hung in miniature. Carnath Prime reduced to light and shadow and heat. One future burned there, so vivid the eyes watered. Streets clogged with the beautiful logic of catastrophe. Pilgrims' banners catching fire and writing their saints in smoke. A tide of cultists broke against the cathedral steps while gun servitors died in order. Macro batteries spoke and nobody listened. The picture held long enough to hurt, then slid. Another future rose in its place, cleaner and worse. The Inquisition's sigil waxed like a winter sun. Purity spread as flame spreads. Whole districts became charcoal diagrams. The cathedral stood intact, alone on a plateau of ash. Stone watched her own hand in that version give orders she would have to live with for the rest of a long, sleepless life. Holden bowed his head, not in prayer but in recognition. This was the victory zeal writes when it runs out of other ink. The third was stranger. The spires were still wounded, yes, but the morning that followed them felt like a room after laughter. Smoke drifted in lanes instead of walls. The enemy lines cut wrong angles, opened flanks they shouldn't have. The Crimson Sentinels emerged from directions geometry didn't like, and their brutality looked, for once, like mercy. "They are all true," Loki said softly, hands lifted but empty. "Until someone believes one the hardest." Holden's voice didn't carry judgment, only habit. "If you show them this, they'll choose the most pain." "Good," Loki said. "Pain is predictable." Stone inhaled and tasted old stone, new dust, the metallic breath the null gave off when it worked too hard. "We leak the visions," she said. "Not to our officers. To theirs." Rhodes' lenses clicked as his mind ran uphill after the idea. We would need a pathway into their auguries. They filter noise through beliefs. Then give them a belief, Loki said. Dress it in their colors. Varric is dead. Fill the vacuum he left with a prophecy that flatters their malice. Holden's gauntlet flexed once, a tick he usually beat into stillness. Deception is a tool that cuts the hand that holds it. It cuts any hand that holds it wrong, Loki replied. You wield absolutes. Wield this with the same care. Stone folded her arms. Rhodes, can you corrupt their channel without hanging a sign on it that says, Courtesy of the Ordo? The Muggos mechadendrites trembled, insulted on two fronts, by the implication and by the challenge. Yes, he said, which meant no, not cleanly. But he would try, and the trying would be beautiful. He set to work, muttering to the slate as if it required coaxing and praise. While he dances with ghosts, Stone said, turning to the sisters, we prepare a path our enemies do not expect. The null frame hummed as the sisters adjusted it for movement. Loki tilted his head, reading the air above the pit. The webway gate, he said. It will not remain polite for long. He was right. The air under the cathedral felt suddenly like a tide about to come in. Sarilith stepped from the maintenance corridor as though she'd been sculpted by the pressure there and simply decided to stop resisting. Light bent for her, the way a room leans toward a singer who hasn't opened her mouth yet. It will hold while you need it, she said without greeting. No longer. And the cost? Stone asked. You lose the comfort of thinking your corridors are all human. Sarilith's gaze found Holden and did not look away. Your warriors carry faith like a beacon. The webway dislikes beacons. But it tolerates momentum. Holden looked back, steady as a cliff. If the path serves the Emperor's purpose, it serves mine. That is a language the webway understands, she said, which might have been an insult or respect. Rhodes hissed satisfaction. Symbols cleared a logjam on his slate. I have a seam, he said. A liturgy looped through their augury. It expects omen and offers authority. We can make our visions appear as the fulfillment of an old promise to strike the spire. Do it, Stone said. Slow. Make them feel like they discovered it. Loki's images leaned into the seam as if they had weight. The burning future came first, wrapped in words that tasted of hunger and pride. The clean worse future followed, stamped with righteousness. The third hovered a fraction of a heartbeat longer, then faded as if embarrassed by hope. Almost too neat, Rhodes murmured, fingers flicking. Almost. Leave a stutter, Loki said. Let one rune glitch. The faithful love a typo in their scripture. Holden made the sign of the Aquila. Blasphemy. Typographical, Loki said, unbothered. The amphitheater trembled the way Earth does before something heavy makes up its mind. Above them, guns thumped with a cold regularity. The city spoke a language of metal and flame. Stone listened for a change in its grammar and heard it. Tiny, but there. A wing of raiders peeled off early, scenting their favorite ending. A destroyer captain corrected course toward the spire, devout in his desire to give them what they feared most. Cultists began to flow down alleys that would, in 20 minutes, be kill lines. They're choosing, Rhodes whispered. They're choosing wrong. Then we meet them where wrong becomes irreversible, Stone said. She turned to Holden. Take your sentinels through the path the farser opens. Cut their rear as they commit to the spire. If the path collapses, you fight your way out. If you die in there, you die loudly. Holden inclined his helm. We do everything loudly. He looked at Loki then, and the thing between them, a duty shaped like suspicion, a suspicion shaped like gratitude, sat down and behaved for once. Walk with us. No weapons, Stone warned. I only brought an audience, Loki murmured. And an editor. They moved. The cathedral's lower halls were a maze of history and neglect. The webway seemed sad at the seam of them, an accidental door waiting for an argument to open it. Sarilith lifted her spear and drew a line in the air where Stone insisted there was nothing. It parted the way frost parts under a warm finger. Beyond, a corridor that felt like the ocean forgot to finish becoming solid. Astartes' boots found new rhythm there. The crimson sentinels entered like red punctuation into a white sentence. The path echoed with a sound that wasn't sound so much as geometry agreeing to be walked on. Holden kept his men in tight formation. Their discipline held the space together the way a spine holds a body upright. The webway tolerated them the way a wild animal tolerates a hunter who knows when to lower the muzzle. Loki stayed close enough to be a problem and far enough not to be the worst one. He watched the corridor's edges the way a locksmith watches hands. Every so often his head turned, as if listening to a joke that only reality was telling. Once, he reached out and tapped the air, and a ripple of wrong drifted sidewise until it was a harmless inconvenience behind them instead of a rip in front. Holden noticed. He didn't thank him yet. He saved it for later or never. Behind them, Stone stayed in the amphitheater and became orbit around which a dozen moving parts turned. She fed the leak along Rhodes' channel in careful increments. Her voice found men who didn't know they wanted to be steadier and made them steady. She moved civilians through corridors the enemy thought were closed. She told the batteries when to wait, which is harder than telling them when to fire. The first skirmish inside the webway arrived without announcement. A crack opened in space that was too neat to be an accident and too petulant to be design. From it came things that wore shapes like they were trying on costumes. Blades with opinions, faces that tested a dozen expressions and settled on hunger. The sentinels met them with bolters and contempt. The webway shuddered around the noise, disliked it, tolerated it. Loki didn't cast anything. He picked a bolt round in flight with 2 fingers and asked it, very politely, to curve between one rib and another instead of flattening against a plate. The bullet obliged, and a thing that had never yet learned its own name died with surprise. Holden saw that too. He also saw Loki ignore a clean chance to show off, choosing instead to make a ricochet harmless for the Marine behind him whose left heel dragged when he was tired. Wisdom looks like humility when you don't expect it. Holden adjusted the catalog he kept in his head under the word witch. The definition stayed. The edges softened. They reached a junction where the bone-bright corridor forked into a knot of similarities. Serelith lifted her spear. Ghost light ran along veins in the wraithbone, mapping possibility. Here, she said. This path comes up inside their staging, between the munitions and the zeal. Perfect, Holden said, which in his mouth meant difficult and necessary. They broke back into the world like divers breaking the skin of a lake. The air stank of promethium and hot hatred. They were behind the raiders, inside their confidence. Cult banners hung like wet tongues. A war engine kneeling to be serviced tried to rise in time and didn't. The sentinels opened it like a letter and read its gears aloud. For a heartbeat, the enemy believed they were the ones who had surprised the universe. Then the bullets did their work and belief recalibrated. Holden's vox filled with overlapping reports. Stone's voice threaded through them like a needle. They're fully committed to the spire, she said, and Loki could hear the satisfaction she refused to show. We hold them there. You break them here. Rhodes, mark positions for Macro Battery 9. On my count. Loki stood in the lee of a shattered bulkhead and watched the joke become a plan and the plan become an answer. He felt the null's absence like the removal of a weight he had gotten used to carrying. He could have made a spectacle. A green arc, a dozen ravens, a laugh that teaches a blade humility. Instead he found a single bolt about to overpenetrate into a promethium line and showed it kindly, another path. The universe, pleased to be taken seriously, cooperated. Now, Stone said into the city's ear. From orbit, Macro Battery 9 spoke with a long, patient syllable that only ever means one thing. The ground lifted its shoulders to it and then remembered to be ground again. The raiders learned what happens when you choose the worst ending because you love how it sounds. The webway behind Holden thrummed, displeased by the resonance, but it held. Serelith flinched like a conductor hearing a wrong note hit perfectly. Push, Holden said, and they did, and the push became a fall that the enemy didn't know how to stop. When it was over enough to be called almost, Holden stood in smoke that wanted to be fog and turned. Loki was looking at a child hiding behind a stack of munitions crates, eyes vast and feral. He tilted his head, made his hands empty, and said in a voice that always knew where the trapdoor was, "You can breathe now." The kid blinked, then coughed, then ran toward the sound of his own name shouted from somewhere sane. Holden filed that too, In a drawer he labeled later. On the other side of the path, Stone exhaled a breath she had been holding since the first shell decided to be a bird. Rhodes sagged into a sit that looked like prayer had ambushed him and won. The sisters loosened their grips on the frame not because they believed, but because their muscles were human. Loki's illusions above the pit faded one by one like actors leaving a stage. The third lingered a moment longer than was respectful. Stone let it. Then she keyed her vox and said, so flat it rang like metal, "We're not done." No one argued. The city, ridiculous and stubborn, prepared to keep living. Smoke thinned into a bruised afternoon, but the air still tasted like hot pennies and prayers. Holden's sentinels held the artery they'd carved through the raiders. The webway behind them pulsed like a muscle clenching on a swallowed thorn. Sarilith lifted her spear and listened to a pressure no human ear could trust. "The path weakens," she said evenly. "You may have 2 crossings left, perhaps one if you insult it." "Then we don't," Holden said. "We bow and leave." He looked to Loki, found him studying the sky through a shattered roof panel, as if the hive's smoke were only a curtain he could part with a thought. Stone's voice found them both on the vox, calm enough to frighten. "All squads, report status and shape your lines. The enemy has chosen the spire as predicted. Their flagship is drifting to low orbit to bless it. If that benediction lands, we lose the district." Rhodes' channel cut in, tinny with excitement and fear. "Inquisitor, their auguries now carry our seeded omens as certainty. Their captain wants theater. He intends to perform above the cathedral, broadside liturgies at skimming altitude." Loki smiled like someone who had guessed the next card before it turned. A man who loves an audience will sail where the applause is loudest. Holden checked the mag on his bolter and watched 2 of his Marines redistribute ammo without being told. "How do you make a ship love a cliff?" he asked, not to mock. "You don't," Loki said. "You make it love a path that ends at one." Stone's reply came clipped. "Say it and do it are not the same thing." "Of course," Loki said pleasantly, "which is why you will let me use your amphitheater again." The suggestion landed with the weight of a dare. The sisters guarding the frame near Holden turned their blank faces toward him as if he had just suggested laughter in a tomb. Stone took 2 beats to answer. You could hear her balancing sin against necessity. "You'll work inside the null," she said at last. "If your trick needs more than your mouth, it dies." "My mouth," Loki said, "has made entire kingdoms." He nodded toward the webway seam. "Send your sentinels back now while it forgives you. Leave a knife here to twist when the flagship commits." Holden gave orders that had been living in his jaw already. The Astartes fell back in perfect ugly beauty, carrying the weight of victory like it was a reliquary they'd stolen and were ashamed to love. Sarilith walked with them until the scene tasted right and then withdrew, expression clean of relief or regret. The path shivered as the last armored heel vanished and then smoothed itself like water's surface lying about ever having been broken. Back under the cathedral, the amphitheater felt tighter, as if the null had grown possessive since they left. Stone stood on her worn line and watched Loki step into the frame without ceremony. He didn't test its limits. He let it take his edges and make him small in the way a scalpel is small. Rhodes hovered with a slate that looked, in his hands, like a rosary he believed in too hard. "Tell me the pieces," Stone said. "Debris fields above the city," Loki replied. "Your guns have thrown up more ruin than your janitors can love. We will persuade those bones to pretend to be a minefield for one long, honest minute." "Pretend," Holden said, taking up his place at Stone's shoulder. "Suggestion is physics your heart understands," Loki said. "Ships have machine spirits, yes? They fear patterns. We write a pattern in the dark they will not insult. We also make their augurs see what their pride expects." Rhodes' eyes glittered with numbers. "I can remap sensor ghosts along a vector with a timed stutter. Macro Battery 9 and Point Defense 7s can push slag into a corridor if we risk frying our own trajectories." "Do it," Stone said. "Make the corridor look like obedience and the edges like blasphemy." Holden flicked open a channel to the flak towers around the spire. "On my mark, stagger your fires and leave a path that looks like an invitation and tastes like disrespect." Understood, chaplain. Came a dozen voices that believed in everything he asked, even when he asked for sin. Loki lifted his hands and spoke to the room the way a man speaks to a skittish horse. No power lit his fingers. The null drank that kind of vanity dry. The power lived in how he shaped the story. He spoke to Rhodes' slate like it could be charmed into genius, to the battery crews as if they were musicians finding the downbeat, to the orbiting ruin as if it wanted, very badly, to be useful one last time. He spoke to the flagship's hungry pride through the crack in the enemy augurs they had already made. He gave it a path that looked like a coronation. The city listened again. Above, Macro 9 breathed and a long column of slag rose in a gentle arc like a spine beginning a bow. Point Defense 7s coughed with choreographed contempt, knocking smaller debris into place until the space above the spire wore a suggestion of teeth. Rhodes' ghosts marched in time, augur lights becoming a procession of false promises. The corridor he left through that danger, narrow, shining with chance, humming with unrighteous reward, looked like destiny to someone eager to be seen defying it. Stone stood still enough that stillness felt like an action. The sisters' blank faces turned upward as if they could watch the sky through stone. Holden prayed without words, which is how you pray when you don't want any god to feel invited. Rhodes' voice went thin. They're taking it. Loki's smile thinned too, became only the part that was interest. Of course they are. The flagship cut its altitude like an actor cutting silence, broadside presenting itself to the holy geometry of the cathedral. It sang over the Vox in a voice so overfull of certainty it could only be a lie it told itself. The corridor welcomed it until the exact second Loki's story told the corridor to stop welcoming. The machine spirit blinked, saw the pattern as blasphemy, and jerked away toward the safe edge. The safe edge did not exist. Stone felt the impact with her teeth. The ground hummed a warning and then stopped. Over the command net, a sound like a hymn forgetting its words. Rhodes exhaled a ragged laugh and clapped a gauntlet over his vocoder to hide it. Holden didn't laugh. His jaw did something a jaw does when mercy triumphs by cruel means. Damage? Stone asked. Catastrophic, Rhodes said reverently. They've rammed a field of meaning we taught them to fear. They're venting their confidence into low orbit. Holden looked at Loki and did not say thank you. He didn't need to. The absence of accusation was loud enough. The moment of relief lasted exactly that long. A new sound entered the Vox. Not a voice but a choir of knives. The raiders' scrap code liturgies, angry at being outperformed, poured into the city's channels like acid. Orders softened, then contradicted themselves. A battery believed the spire was an enemy for a full 2 breaths. A corridor full of refugees turned around because an authoritative lie told them the other way led to safety. Stone felt the control she had braided begin to fray in 100 places. Rhodes' hands flew. They're poisoning the net. Piggybacking our stutter. Clever bastards. Cut to line-of-sight semaphores and runners, Stone said. Purge anything that sings. Sisters, isolate the amphitheater's feeds. The null hummed higher. Loki's face changed the way a mask changes when it hears a line it has learned to hate. They are making faith noisy, he said. We need a silence so the right voices carry. Then you work here, Stone said, and gestured to the frame that had already claimed him. If your trick needs dance, it dies. If it needs conviction, speak. He nodded and began the unglamorous part, calling units by name, finding the note each officer trusted, telling small truths in the tone of their own commanders so they'd travel farther, faster. He sent runners where human legs still beat machine lies. He invented a new hand signal on the fly that meant hold the line and forgive the last order, and then taught it to 12 squads with 3 words and a metaphor. The null made him honest whether he liked it or not. It also made him efficient. Holden watched the work with the uneasy respect of a mason watching someone shore up a wall with reeds and somehow stop the collapse. He opened a private channel. Why stay? You could have slipped the sisters and gone to the roof where your hands matter. Loki glanced at Stone and let the truth stand between them. Because she asked me to lose beautifully if I must. Stone didn't flinch at being understood. She took the open space and stepped into it. One more push, she said into the net, voice level, tired, unstoppable. Then we bleed, then we bandage, then we count. Macro 9, reload and sleep. Point defense 7, you're my drum. Sentinel spearhead, break what still believes in itself. Civilians, third corridor on my mark. Runners, move. The scrap code fought like a swarm of dull razors. The city answered with flags on rooftops and men with lamps and women with knives who knew which alleys were liars. Loki cut lies by naming them aloud. Holden cut lies by planting himself where panic wanted a hole. Rhodes cut lies by strangling them with better math. Serelith returned to the edge of the webway, eyes on a horizon no human could see, spear angled toward a future that was trying to wriggle free of its obligations. When it broke all at once, the way storms sometimes do when they remember they've rained enough to be impressive. The enemy's last organized push dissolved not under fire alone, but under the embarrassment of bad timing. The flagship burned in a graceful curve that would have been art if anyone had wanted to build a museum for it. A pocket of cultists in a hospital stairwell found themselves surrounded by people whose patience had run out. Stone stood still and took inventory that started with living and moved outward. The amphitheater's hum eased a fraction. The feather Loki had dropped earlier sat forgotten at the edge of the plinth, and a draft that should not have existed turned at once, as if approving the design of the day. She looked at Loki, took in the hollowed brightness around his eyes where the null wore at men who pretended it didn't, and made a decision her superiors would have wanted her to make with more paperwork and fewer seconds. You have 1 hour, she said quietly. Use it to help, or waste it on theater. Either way, stay within my city. When it's done, we speak again. Loki regarded the hour as if tasting it. His smile, when it came, was smaller and infuriatingly sincere. Then I choose to make a joke that keeps breathing. Holden heard the words and filed them under later. Outside, the sky had just begun to consider being blue again. Somewhere, a bell that had refused to ring all day found its courage and tried twice, then succeeded. The webway seemed flickered like a thought someone had nearly lost, and Serelith, watching future and present argue, tilted her head as if hearing a door she could not yet name slide open. Loki spent the first minute of his hour walking without looking like he was in a hurry. Haste frightens people. He let the cathedral's smoke cling to him and left the amphitheater by a side stair that had forgotten it was important. Outside, the city pressed close. Alleys kneaded into narrowness by centuries, light cut into knives by scaffolds and shattered glass. He took a corner and found a barricade of benches and broken pews where a dozen civilians had decided to survive. A guardsman with 2 wide pupils leveled a loss at him with both hands. You're late, Loki told the weapon kindly, as if it had apologized. It's the fashion today. Stay back, the guardsman stammered. Someone behind him sobbed into a sleeve. Loki didn't step forward. He studied the barricade the way a locksmith studies a stubborn lock. One bench wedged wrong, a low beam braced against a statue's hip instead of its knee. He touched the beam with 2 fingers and the world obliged by remembering a different angle. The barricade settled an inch, more stable. The guardsman blinked again, and lowered his barrel as if an invisible hand had guided his elbows down. Route 3, Loki said, pointing down an alley that had been rubble an hour ago and was now merely unwise. Take it until you smell oranges. Turn left where you expect not to. Keep your heads down where your heads want up. Go now. Why oranges? Asked the sobbing sleeve, finding its mouth. Because a cart overturned there this morning, Loki said. Because you'll smell it and know I didn't invent the road. They went. He watched them long enough to see their bodies learn momentum, then turned toward a noise that pretended it wasn't a scream. The transit tunnel had collapsed like a lung. A Medici team stood at its mouth, white aprons gray with ash, arguing with physics about a slab that had decided to be inevitable. A boy lay beneath it up to the chest, mouth open, eyes glass-bright with too much air and not enough of anything else. A sister of silence stood nearby, helmet off, the null around her like a sincerity no one had asked for. Loki felt it scrape his edges as he came close, taking the shine off his intentions. He stopped at its fringe and bowed as if to a throne. She stared at him like a stone stares. Impartially, utterly. He set his palms against the slab. He did not push. He listened. Stone remembers how it was laid. It also remembers the one thing it didn't agree with. The slab had a fracture line like a forgotten word. He found it and spoke it back to the rock. The shift was so small a witness could have lied about seeing it, but the weight redistributed and the medicized Jack could suddenly be a hero. The slab lifted enough for hands to become useful. The sister's eyes narrowed, the only sign she disapproved of something she couldn't quite forbid. Loki backed away, surrendering the space to human competence. As he did, the boy's breath remembered to be true. He turned his head and saw the sister first. She gave him nothing, no blessing, no smile, and somehow that steadied him. Then he saw Loki. Their eyes met for a second, and Loki did something very dangerous. He looked like he was proud of someone else. He left before anyone could decide what to call him. The hour became a string of edits. In a stairwell that twisted like a lie, he turned panic into momentum by moving a single bucket so that the line formed naturally instead of clogging. On a roof that had tried to be a kiln, he coaxed 3 pigeons out of a locked eave so that the children who had been watching for omens would laugh at something foolish while the fire dithered. In a plaza where 2 squads bristled at each other through mistaken orders, he stepped between them and told one commander a joke about a saint's left shoe that only someone from that commander's home hive would know. The man laughed, then listened harder, and the barrels dipped. He did show off twice. Once when a hull plate sheared loose from a dead skimmer and scythed toward a knot of refugees. He turned it into a panel of rippled light that passed through them like water, then turned back into metal when it hit open air and clanged harmlessly against masonry. Once when a cultist charged him with a chain knife and the only thing between Loki and disassembly was a very honest impulse to live. He lifted his hand and the knife unwound itself into a handful of small, embarrassed cogs. The cultist looked at his palm, at the pile of failure, and ran in a direction that turned out to be the wrong one for his continued survival. Loki didn't watch him go. Half an hour in, Holden found him on the rim of a square where statues of former governors stood decapitated from older, quieter hatred. The chaplain had soot smudged into the cracks of his armor and a line of not blood across one shin plate where something had tried to decide what he was and failed. He paused as one pauses when the mind has finally caught up with the body and found it still standing. "You spend miracles on small things," he said. "Small things spend better," Loki replied. "They buy interest. Interest buys time." Holden examined the square. 2 Marines were reloading by habit rather than need. A woman with her hair singed to velvet stubble gave her water to a dog that had decided to live. In one corner, a man in a governor's livery stripped medals from a corpse and put them in his pocket as if the dead still required them to travel. Holden let that pass. "Time for what?" "For not becoming the thing you hate to defeat," Loki said lightly, and then more seriously. "For a question you haven't asked." Holden's jaw worked. "I asked you in the nave what you wanted in return. You never answered." "I did," Loki said. "You didn't like the shape." The chaplain could have pushed. He didn't. "The Inquisitor will call you back soon." He was right. Stone's voice found them like a fact. "All command units to status green. Casualty lines opening. Loki, your hour is nearly done." He glanced up at the sky as if the sun kept time like a metronome. The bruise yellow had thinned to something that could be called afternoon without courage. He turned his gaze to the cathedral spire, surprised twice, first by the intactness of its angles, second by his own reluctance to go back under it. "Walk with me," Holden said abruptly. They crossed a walkway that had been cobbled from scaffolds and faith while the shells were still telling the city who was in charge. The drop made mockery of consequence. Holden placed each step perfectly without looking. Loki placed his without admitting he was careful. Below, a team of volunteers passed bricks hand to hand in a rhythm that looked like a prayer refusing to become a chant. At the foot of the cathedral, Stone waited. She had sent her cloak to be cleaned or burned or made into bandages. She stood in plain coat and dust, a pistol at her hip and a fatigue that lived honestly in the corners of her mouth. The sisters formed a quiet bracket around her. Rhodes hovered nearby, slate gone dim for the first time since dawn, as if it were trying not to disturb the room. "You chose to spend it," Stone said. "No question." Her eyes ruled out flattery, which was a relief. He disliked being forced to lie twice. I told a good joke, Loki said. People laughed by breathing. You saved more than you endangered, she allowed, and that was a benediction in her dialect. She tipped her chin toward the amphitheater stairs. Back to the room without echoes. He went willingly, not because he trusted rooms but because he liked stages. The amphitheater felt pleased with itself, which in a null sounded like fewer complaints. The frame waited, purring. He stepped into it and let it shrink him until only his voice moved easily. Stone stood at the rim, same worn line under her boots, and regarded him like a riddle that had stopped being fun and started being necessary. If I let you go, she said, voice even, what will you take? He had anticipated many questions. He had not anticipated the grace of that one. How it assumed agency, not ownership. He could have answered with a line about souvenirs or saint's teeth or a clever theft. He did not. Only the punchline, he said. Holden's head tilted, curious despite himself. Which is? That hope and mischief share a spine, Loki said. He almost shrugged, almost smiled. It is an anatomical truth. Silence considered becoming judgment and decided against it. Rhodes scratched something on his slate and then stopped, annoyed at himself. Stone did not move for a heartbeat, then another, as if listening for a second question that did not exist. She exhaled, and the shape of the breath said she knew how bureaucracy would prefer this to end. She did not intend to let bureaucracy write her last paragraph. You're not ours, she said. But for this hour you weren't our enemy. That's the most generous title I've had in years, Loki said lightly. It expires, she said. Everything does, he answered, and meant it. She gestured. The sisters powered the frame down until the hum became merely rude. The cold around him receded and he took a step that looked very much like a bow. Something small slipped from his sleeve and struck the stone with a soft note. He didn't look at it. Neither did she. Not yet. Outside, the bells that had failed all day decided to try again. They found each other across districts like friends meeting after war. The city took the sound into its mouth and tasted it, uncertain and then sure. Holden closed his eyes for the length of one breath and opened them with the same hard kindness he always wore. Rhodes lifted his gaze to the ceiling as if the equations there had been erased and rewritten in a cleaner hand. Stone broke the almost peace with a fact. Chaos isn't done. Their scrap code will crawl the net for days. There'll be knives in the Medicae queues and sermons in the soup lines. You bought us a win. Now we buy what it costs. Loki raised 2 fingers in a salute so slight it might have been a fidget. Costs are interesting. They tell you what you valued without asking. And what do you value? She asked. The laugh after fear, he said. The breath after ash. The moment before a zealot admits a nuance. Holden snorted, which for him was practically applause. Don't wait on me. Loki's grin widened one notch. I am patient in exactly the wrong ways. Stone's gaze flicked at last to the small thing on the stone near his feet. A feather lay there, green not by dye but by decision, runes etched along the veins so fine they looked like light. She didn't pick it up. She didn't ask if it was a gift or a signature or a dare. Rest, she said to her people, which meant do 10 more impossible things before night and then fall over. To Loki she said, stay where I can find you for a little longer. I'll be a very tall secret, he said. He turned, stepped out of the frame, and walked toward the stair with the loose-limbed grace of a man who knows how many doors he can open in a house not built for him. At the threshold he paused, as if listening to the bells. Despair is boring, he murmured almost to himself, and vanished into the cathedral's darker hum. Serelith waited in a shadow near the maintenance corridor. Spear slanted like a note. She watched him go with the expression of someone who saw the skein twitch in a tolerable way. Then she looked past him toward Stone and Holden and Rhodes and the sisters and the feather that had decided not to be a coin anymore and said, to no one who would admit to hearing, 1 thread more and the pattern holds. The hour ended. The city did not. It did what cities do when they survive. It started counting. Counting began as argument and became ritual. Names were tallied against faces, faces against breaths, breaths against the stubborn math of what a hive can lose and still call itself a hive. The bells found each other across districts and rang out of tune, which was somehow the right tune. Stone walked the cathedral's nave with a slate in one hand and a map in her head that wanted new edges. Rhodes followed like a shadow that kept stopping to calculate light. Holden checked on squads without creating a prayer circle around himself, which is harder than it sounds. The city was not done arguing. Scrap code scuttled in the wires like vinegar in milk, curdling orders. A chant nobody taught anyone spread through 2 neighborhoods and tried to become a riot. The wreck of the flagship shed pieces of itself across the upper air. Some fell as bragging embers, some as knives. And somewhere in the ruined quarters beneath the spire, a group of men and women in robes looted from old pieties began to shape a circle around a shard of something that did not belong in air. Serelith felt it first, a pressure change in the skein that made her tilt her head the way a hunter tilts it when the wind spoils. She stepped from the seam in the maintenance corridor and found Stone on the stairs before the Inquisitor could reach the roof. "One thread more," she said, and the words weren't metaphor. "Under the spire's western buttress. They are trying to make your victory rhyme with a different word." Stone didn't ask how the farcer knew. Some kinds of knowledge are billed on delivery. "Holden," she said into the vox. "With me. Sisters. Half circle. Nulls ready. Rhodes, keep the net quiet as a church for 5 minutes." Rhodes sucked air. 5 busy minutes. "Quiet," she repeated. "No songs. No sermons." They found Loki standing in a side chapel where a statue had lost its head in some older riot and kept its dignity. He had obeyed her order to stay where she could find him with the infuriating competence of a man who also knew a dozen ways to leave. When she called, he came. And when she said nothing, he did not fill the silence with anything but attention. They moved through the western buttress like an answer moving through a question. The air changed first, a Swedish metal that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with engines that believed in never stopping. The chamber's floor had been swept into geometry with the patience of despair. In the center, perched on a tripod made from sacrificial tables, a shard of the flagship spine sang a note at the edge of hearing. Around it, a dozen robed figures rocked, faces raw from weeping and grit, tongues hanging on a rhythm that wasn't theirs. At their head stood a preceptor in a collar of dayton needles, eyes milk-white with the ecstasy of being sure. He lifted his hands as if to push the shard through a hole the world didn't have yet. "Nulls," Stone said, and the sisters stepped forward with their silence and made a circle where sound forgot itself. The shard's song frayed. The preceptor faltered as if his feet had been lied to. Holden moved like punctuation. 1, 2, 3, and a pair of guards fell without discovering who had corrected them. Loki did not step into the null. He stayed at its rim, where tricks go thin and words have to do their real work. He looked at the robed faces and saw the rawness for what it was. Grief turned into a hobby, rage into a schedule. He raised his voice, not loud, precise. "They told you that you'd be the knife," he said. "They forgot to mention you are also the whetstone. You wear your throats like a uniform and call it faith. Does it feel like belonging to be written as a punchline in someone else's joke?" The preceptor blinked as if slapped. "Blasphemer." "Frequently," Loki agreed. "But answer me this. Do your gods ever let you choose where to laugh?" The chant stumbled. People can't hum and think at the same time. That's why armies sing. One woman near the outer edge broke rhythm, eyes dragging to the sister nearest her. In that old cold, her certainty looked like a coda size too big. She took a step sideways that could have been a stumble and became a decision. Holden met the preceptor halfway. The chaplain's crozius came down. The collar of needles tore free in a spray of regret. The preceptor tried one last scrap of theater, a phrase in a machine's liturgy pitched to make the shard sing louder. Stone's pistol took the word apart on its way out of his mouth. He fell without discovering how heavy certainty becomes when it has to carry its own weight. The circle cracked. Robes slumped or fled or stood bewildered at the space where their leader had always belonged. Loki moved along the rim like a tide marking highest reach and found the shard song again, the part that wasn't brag but memory. He spoke into it as if into a bell, and the bell answered, the notes sliding down into something human ears could forgive. Be stone, he told it. Be ship no more. The shard's edges lost their appetite. It clicked once, twice, cooling. The sister nearest it stepped in and laid a hand on the tripod. The null made the gesture plain, almost rude. The geometry gave up on itself and became just swept floor again. Rhodes' voice itched over the vox with held breath. 40 seconds until the net wants to sing without us. Make it hum instead, Stone said, and he did, weaving in static that sounded exactly like ruins settling after a wind. They took the chamber apart the way you take apart a lie you've told yourself, gently at first, then with increasing irritation. Holden broke the tripod. Stone collected the needles. The sisters pointed people toward corridors that led upward and outward and would hurt their legs in a way that counted as penance. The woman who had stepped sideways passed Loki and did not meet his eyes. He didn't claim her with a look either. Some choices are fragile if you praise them. On the way back up, the city made new noises. Some were administrative, clipboards and buckets, stretchers and arguments about order of care. Some were instinct animals calling each other to the parts of town that still tasted like home. Somewhere, a small street organ that had no right to have survived coughed itself into life and played half a hymn and then half a drinking song and decided that was enough. On the cathedral roof, the view was a chart no chart could hold. Smoke in lanes. Fire in manageable pieces. A coil of black across the sky where the flagship had unlearned how to be proud. Distant, a scatter of raider shards trying to pretend they were still a strategy. Stone took it in and let relief come in like a tide to the knees and stopped there. Holden came to stand beside her, helm off for once, hair pasted to his skull by sweat and ash. He did not look younger without the medal. He looked exactly the age of someone who had believed too many absolutes and kept most of them anyway. You were right about the last thread, he said, which was as much apology as he had ever planned to make to fate. Serelith stepped into the rooftop light as if it were tailored. The skein holds, she said. For now. For now is expensive, Stone answered. Send me the bill. That is not how my people do it, the farcer said. She inclined her head the exact degree that meant respect without entanglement. Loki leaned his elbows on the parapet and watched a column of smoke write something in a script only he could read. Maybe it said future. Maybe it said joke. He felt the weird tug that came when a choice he had already made wanted to be made again, for the pleasure of it. He ignored it. He was fond of his own appetite. He did not let it drive. You told them a thing I would not have, Stone said without turning. About being a punchline. They already knew it, Loki said. I only said the quiet parts so they could hear themselves. And if they had not stepped away, then your sister's hand would have done the rest, he said. My words are cheap. Her silence is not. Holden glanced at the sister in question. She had put her helm back on and might have been a statue for all the city could wring from her. He nodded to her with a respect he rarely distributed so lightly. She did not nod back. It didn't matter. Rhodes arrived late to the roof, having argued the net into behaving like a well-trained mule. He lifted his slate, stopped, and for the first time all day lifted his eyes first. Macro 9 is sleeping. 7 is cleaning barrels. The escorts that remain are quarreling with trajectory. I think they're leaving so they can write this down as someone else's fault. Let them, Stone said. We have our own writing to do. She tapped the slate with a finger. I want a broadcast. No hymns. No propaganda. A list and a promise. Rhodes' fingers hovered. Say the words. She did not raise her voice. The city raised it for her. We will count our dead and name them. We will shelter our living and number them only when they ask to be numbered. If you carry a knife for chaos, you will not find a comfortable prison here. If you carry hunger and fear, you will find soup and a job. If you carry certainty, this city will make you work for it. She paused. And if you carry a joke that saves a life, you can tell it in my street. Rhodes looked at Loki as if to check whether jokes required licensing. Loki gave him a little flourish that could have been indulgence or benediction. The broadcast went out in the plain voice of a woman who had spent the day not being poetic. It threaded through the alleys and over the roofs, into the ruined sanctums and the smelling kitchens, into the ears of people with soot where their eyelashes should be. It did not ask for more than anyone had left to give. That may have been why it landed. Evening arrived from the edges inward. Real Blue tried the sky on and found it still fit. The cathedral bells settled into a rhythm that sounded like a heart remembering it would get to beat again tomorrow and the next day, one beat at a time. Stone's Vox ticked once with a private channel. "Your hour is over," she said, not unkind. Loki nodded and didn't pretend to misunderstand. He reached into his coat and found nothing there because he had already dropped it. The feather lay in the amphitheater like a question signed in green. He looked out over a city he had complicated and spared, and then, because he was not the kind of liar who pretends not to care, he let himself feel the small, illicit pride of a trick that had saved more people than it hurt. Holden noticed the expression and pretended not to. "If you vanish," he said, "vanish away from my men. They've had enough riddles for one day. I will leave you only obvious problems," Loki said. "You are very good at those." Saralitha's gaze flicked toward the maintenance seam, already thin as a rumor. "It closes," she said. "Everything does," Loki echoed softly. The wind shifted and brought the smell of oranges from somewhere he hadn't expected. He smiled at that. He had told the truth earlier, if only about a cart. It pleased him more than it should have. "Tomorrow," Stone said, "we start being bored on purpose. It keeps zealots sleepy." "Boredom is a craft," he said. "I admire practitioners." She looked at him, then really looked, the way a surgeon looks at a tool that shouldn't exist and does, and saved a life anyway. "You were fun," she said. It sounded like a verdict and a farewell. It was almost dark when the last raider flare faded. Street lamps flickered one by one like cautious thoughts. People came out onto rooftops without guns in their hands. Someone tuned the small organ. It found the hymn this time. It did not play all the verses. That was all right. The city could hum. The city had earned humming. Loki turned from the parapet and walked toward the stair, light as a man leaving a party before the jokes run dry. He did not look back. Looking back ruins the timing. Somewhere below, the amphitheater waited with its silence and its feather and the shape of a choice that had been made correctly, this once at the right time. Night came politely, asking permission from broken windows and getting it. Street lamps woke in uncertain rows. Some never rose, some flared with the enthusiasm of exhaustion, some hummed like content insects. The cathedral's stones cooled. The city's noise turned from survival to maintenance, which is another kind of prayer. In the amphitheater, where silence had worked harder than any soldier, the feather waited on the edge of the plinth as if it had kept watch. Stone picked it up with 2 fingers the way you lift a relic you're not yet sure you're allowed to believe in. The runes along the vein glowed faintly as if remembering light rather than making it. She held it to her slate. The slate refused to translate, which she respected. Up close, the thing looked less like a joke and more like handwriting. Someone's particular curve of thought made visible. She slid it into the inner pocket of her plain coat and told herself it was evidence. Evidence sometimes has to be warmed by skin before it behaves. Rhodes dozed sitting up on the lowest step, chin on his throat, hands still on his slate like a pilgrim hugging a shrine. One of the sisters stood motionless at the entrance, helmet off again, eyes closed. Not resting, not praying, simply in a place where choices go to be quiet. Holden leaned against a pillar with the careful ease of a man who will admit fatigue only when no one is looking. His armor was scarred into a map of the day. He had removed his helm and set it at his feet like a dog that had been told to sit and had obeyed, but not without commentary. "Send the men to their bunks," Stone said softly. "The patrols can be made of people who still insist on being awake." He nodded and spoke the necessary words into the Vox. You could hear men become human again on the other end, voices loosening, boots remembering how to walk without rhythm, the small relief of orders that did not contain the possibility of last words. They went up to the roof one more time because endings like high places. The sky had finally negotiated a truce with itself. Smoke and shadows, stars beginning to be brave, a bruised strip of aurora far off where the night met the wreck's slow, unashamed burning. Carnath Prime lay below like a wounded animal that had decided to live. Reports. Stone asked, and Rhodes, now awake, just produced the numbers that never add up to what you hoped. She listened without flinching. Names would come in the morning, the counting done by people with the right faces for it. Tonight, she wanted only shapes. Districts that would need feed, pipes that would forgive repairs if spoken to kindly, the medici queue already forming like a river knows where the valley is. She told Rhodes what to move, who to spare, which zealous sergeant to send to a soup line before he found a crowd to lead. Holden watched her make a city with words and lists. "You'll write your report," he said, "a statement and a warning and a dare." "I will," she said. "It will say we won. It will also say we were lucky and that luck had a face with horns and a sense of humor." He smiled without pleasure. "They will not like the second part." "They rarely like the true parts," she said. "If they demand a cleaner story, I will give them a longer one." "And if they demand him?" Holden asked, glancing down the dark of the nave as if Loki might materialize from the shadow and applaud his timing. "Then they can come and arrest a rumor," Stone said. "I released no prisoner. I detained a problem and then employed it. It resigned. I have the letter." Holden huffed. "You kept the feather." "I kept evidence," she said, "and then, because honesty sharpens rather than dulls authority when you use it sparingly, I kept a reminder that absolutes have edges. Tomorrow I will be the edge again. Tonight I'm allowed to consider the blade." He accepted that in the way he accepted many things that did not fit his first architecture, by making a space for them and calling it scaffolding until it proved strong enough to be a wall. Below, someone tried the street organ and made it to the end of the hymn this time. People on 3 rooftops clapped in perfect imperfection. The sound carried in a way speeches never do. Serelith stepped up from a shadow like a conclusion you'd been walking toward without naming. She looked less like a statue and more like someone who had just returned from the kind of long, cold swim that makes the lungs proud of themselves. "The seam tolerates one more courtesy," she said. "A door open long enough for a goodbye. Do your people practice goodbyes?" Holden asked, not mocking. "Poorly," she said. "We practice consequences better." Stone glanced toward the nave's darkness and found Loki already there, which saved everyone the embarrassment of pretending to summon him. He had shed ash and gained nothing like fatigue on his face. Only the set of his mouth had altered, as if a joke he liked had finally landed and made him melancholy for its passing. "You have terrible timing," Stone said. "It's a compulsion," he said cheerfully, and then his tone softened. "You have a stubborn city." "It will be more stubborn tomorrow," she said. "I plan to bore it into virtue." "I approve," he said. "Boredom rescues more lives than heroics and is worse at getting statues." He and Holden regarded each other for a second longer than their allowances permitted. "You fought clean when you could have been ornate," Holden said. In his dialect, that was the line why I'm not trying to kill you today. If you ever come back and make me regret saying that, I will write a better ending for you. "I would expect nothing less," Loki said, and the respect in it was real. Rhodes, who had been working up the courage to speak to a problem he couldn't quantify, blurted, "How did you do the thing with the flagship exactly? The pattern fear, the machine spirit, was that. Is there a formula?" "Yes," Loki said. "It goes, pride plus theater divided by opportunity, multiplied by debris." Rhodes made a strangled sound that might have been laughter or heresy. "That's not. It's a good first draft," Loki said mercifully. "You'll finish it." The sister by the stairs didn't move, but her attention sharpened like a knife being held closer to light. Loki inclined his head to her as one professional acknowledges another. She did not return the courtesy, which satisfied everyone's requirements. Serelith turned slightly, and the air beside her remembered the seam. It stood there like a door still deciding what kind of door it wanted to be. Cold came through that wasn't weather. Loki glanced into it and the expression that crossed his face was not triumph or relief. It was appetite checked by discretion, a hand hovering over a cake and then deciding to wait because the joke would be better with witnesses. Stone held out her hand before he could step. He looked at it like it might be a trick and then, perhaps for the first time all day, let surprise edit him. He took it. Her grip was dry, firm, not ceremonial. He felt callous over bone, The exact geography of a person who holds a thing closed because it has to stay closed and opens it when necessary and pays for both. She felt a pulse that was very alive and not particularly interested in being worshipped. "Do not make me write a different report," she said. "Do not make me bored," he said. They let go. He looked at Holden. "Keep your absolutes warm," he said. "They break less easily that way." Holden snorted again, which this time was definitely amusement. "Go before I remember to aim." Loki stepped toward the seam. The webway's light painted his coat in deeper greens. For a heartbeat he paused and looked back. Not at the city, not at the men with weapons, not even at Stone. He looked at the space where the amphitheater sat under their feet, and at the idea of a feather in a pocket, and at a child who had remembered to breathe, and at a joke told to a room that wanted orders and got mercy instead. He nodded once to his own satisfaction, because vanity is honest when it's earned. Then he was gone into a geometry that rewards mischief and punishes laziness. The seam closed like a mouth deciding not to bite. The roof got colder by a whisper. Serelith remained for a moment longer, regarding Stone with eyes that did not apologize for having seen farther. "When you count," she said, "remember to count choices as well as bodies." "We do," Stone said. "Good," the farcer replied. "It keeps the skein honest." She stepped sideways and was not there. They stood for a while and listened to a city try its voice on ordinary tasks. The wind shifted and brought back the smell of oranges from some stubborn corner of market that would insist on opening tomorrow even if all it sold was memory and peels. Rhodes cleared his throat and began to list the morning's jobs. Holden retrieved his helm and did not put it on yet. The sister lifted her eyes to the stars and refused to be moved by them. Stone looked down into the nave where the long aisle ran with dust and footprints and where, tomorrow, lines would form for water and work and absolution that would be denied and forgiveness that would be granted without anyone naming it so. She touched the feather through her coat and did not take it out. She would not give it to the report. She would give it to herself when she needed to remember that sometimes the knife you grimace at is the one that cuts the noose. "Lights out in the upper wards," she said into the vox, and a dozen lamps obeyed with grateful sighs. "Kitchen crews rotate. Medici priority to smoke lung and crush injury. Patrols light. Preach nothing. Feed everything. If you must sing, do it quietly." Holden fell into step beside her as she turned for the stairs. "Boredom," he said, tasting the word like a catechism rewritten. "Craft," she returned. "Learn it." He grunted approval. Behind them, the bells decided to stop. The city breathed in the pause after music and found it bearable. Stone went down into the work. Above, the last of the wreck shed a slow glowing tear and then nothing at all. Somewhere, far from the hive and close to every choice that had been made that day, a man in green kept walking until the corridor ended in maps he hadn't drawn yet. He laughed once, quietly, not unkindly, and began to look for a better joke.